found $3.84 billion in potential waste, that now that they're trying to find trillions to cut down on the budget deficit, it might be a time to look at the Defense Department and stop the reprogramming of money. If it's going to be saved, it ought to be saved, and that means that it would cut down on the deficit.
The Senator has used 10 minutes.
I would like to continue if there's no objection.
Without objection.
Okay. Using modified grading system to reflect the good quality of this audit, it would have earned a higher score were it not for an excessively long completion time. In this particular case, however, the impact of the audit was apparently felt while the audit was still in progress. So the timeliness rule may not apply here and probably should be set aside. There are 3 other audits containing savings and inefficiencies that I'd like to discuss. The next one is entitled The Implementation of the Predator Sky Warrior Acquisition Decision Memorandum, number 2010-082, dated September the 10th, 2010. The purpose of this audit was to determine whether the Air Force and Army had complied with the Department of Defense directives and law to combine the Predator and Sky Warrior drone program. The Defense Department estimated that $400 million could be saved by merging the 2 programs. While the audit was in progress, the Department of Defense pulled the rug out from under the auditors. A new directive was issued stating that the 2 programs did not have to be combined. To counter this move, the auditors recommended administrative action against those who failed to comply with the original directive. The Department of Defense now concurred and tossed the auditors a bone. The Department of Defense wiggled out of harm's way by offering to do meaningless lessons learned exercise. In the end, the auditors caved in, agreeing with the Department of Defense plan was responsive, and backed off. Despite what appeared to be an unsuccessful outcome, the Office of Inspector General still claimed that this audit produced $60 million in savings. The audit itself indicates that the $60 million was, in fact, quote, reprogrammed to meet higher priority operations, end quote. That means it was reallocated to other Department of Defense accounts and thus not saved. Since this audit was all about an opportunity to save $400 million and the Department of Defense balked, maybe these so-called savings might be better characterized as lost savings. In my report card, this audit earned low scores mainly because it failed to verify actual costs of 2 drone contracts using primary source accounting records, and it failed to assess the validity of the Department of Defense estimated savings of $400 million. I'm not convinced this audit deserves a higher score, especially since it took 22.5 months to complete, and the recommendations, though initially tough, were watered down in the end. The last one that I want to report on is entitled The Deferred Maintenance and Carryover of the Army Abrams Tank, number 2010-43, dated March the 2nd, 2010. This report concluded that contrary to the Army's claims, depot maintenance on M1 tanks was not deferred in fiscal year 2008. All planned overhauls were in fact completed, but a large sum of money was left over. The Army requested and received a formal written waiver to carry over $346 million in unneeded and unused fiscal year 2008 M1 maintenance funds for use in 2009 and beyond. The reason given was inadequate capacity at the Lima, Ohio tank plant. Without the waiver, this money would have been canceled and lost. The report concluded that the Army documents contained, quote, unquote, inaccurate, misleading information that may have caused a violation of the Anti-Deficiency Act. It recommended that the waiver be rescinded and $275 million in fiscal year 2008 money be canceled and reprogrammed or reduced. The Army appeared to agree with the recommendations to disclose the $275 million carryover to Congress, but non-concurred with other recommendations. The report does not point to any real savings. The report probably deserves a higher score except for the timeliness and strength of recommendations. It was untimely, taking 22 months to complete. In addition, there were unresolved issues about the waiver document. Did the official who signed the waiver know that the document would have been alleged contained false and misleading information, and was he questioned about its truthfulness? If so, the report should have been recommended that he be held accountable. To summarize, Mr. President, there are two main problems with these 4 reports on savings and collections. And the fourth one I'm not going to go into now to save time, and I'll put that in the record. None was timely, number one. Number two, reported savings were unverified and elusive. First, these 4 reports took an average of 19 months to complete. 2 took a total of 45 months, or almost 4 years to finish, and that does not include the 4 to 6 months it takes to get an audit rolling. As I have said on other occasions, the power of top-quality audit work is greatly weakened by stale information. Second, these 4 reports supposedly produce $4 2/10 billion in collective savings, but all of that money appears to have been shifted to other Department of Defense accounts and spent. To the best of my knowledge, not 1 cent was really saved or redeposited in the taxpayer's bank account. Only in government could you save all the money and still claim savings. What we're really talking about here are lost savings that grew out of waste that was thankfully discovered and avoided, and waste that is avoided surely as monetary benefits. In closing, I'd like to share a simple observation with my colleagues. For some reason, auditors in the Office of Inspector General show a great reluctance to use the word waste, W-A-S-T-E, in their reports. That word rarely, if ever, appears in their audits. At the same time, auditors seem overly eager to tout savings and efficiencies. Now, why would that be? Could it be that their superiors in the Pentagon take a dim view of the word waste? Savings may be nothing more than the flip side of waste. Auditors detect and verify potential waste and then convert it to potential savings by proposing remedies to eliminate the waste. Maybe the auditors need to start calling it what it is, call it waste, W-A-S-T-E, and then talk about savings. I yield the floor.
Madam President.
The Senator from Oklahoma.
Madam President, I ask the minister's consent to be recognized as if in morning business for such time as I shall consume.
Without objection.
Madam President, first of all, we came back. We weren't anticipating coming back from this recess that we were going to be on, and I can't help but think a lot of that was a result of the statements that President Obama had made, criticizing the Senate for leaving at a time when the debt was so bad and all of that, when in fact I think that's a bum rap. I mean, you know, we have a serious problem I think we need to address, and that is the spending. And all these things that President Obama is doing right now to make everyone think that we're trying to address it, appointing committees, appointing groups to get together, having the Vice President head up this group and the other group, and Republicans and Democrats, all the President has to do is quit spending. Madam President, I've been here for a few years, and I remember all during the Clinton administration. During the Clinton administration, I remember 1995, I came down to this podium on the floor complaining that President Clinton had come out with a new budget, and that budget was $1.5 trillion. I said, this is just unbelievable. It's not sustainable. We can't do it. And that was $1.5 trillion to run this country for a period of 1 year. Now, this president has come up with 3 budgets. Each one of the budgets is multi-trillion-dollar deficit budgets. The last one, $1.65 trillion. Now, Madam President, this is more than the total amount of money it took to run the entire country, and it's all in the president's budget. It comes out initially $800 billion for stimulus that didn't stimulate. This was something that I don't know I don't know why either nobody cares or the American people aren't listening. It's very, very simple. We have a problem because the president spends money like no one else has in history. Here he is right now. He has actually raised the debt more than every president from George Washington to George W. Bush. Every president. And yet he comes out and has a big mission. Well, what are we going to do about spending? The answer is quit spending. Well, hopefully the American people remember this, and this is not the reason, frankly, that I'm down here today, because in spite of what you might be reading and led to believe in the various publications, other things are going on. There is one piece of legislation, Madam President, that I'm going to be introducing tomorrow. I've been working on it for a year, for about 6 months. And I've talked to people. We have caucuses in the United States Senate about every kind of concern. We have an Army caucus, an Air Force caucus. We have caucuses on caucuses. But one of the caucuses we have is a general aviation caucus. I'm particularly sensitive to this in that I've been flying airplanes for over 50 years, and it's one where you're dealing with single-issue people. Well, anyway, tomorrow, Wednesday, I'm going to introduce legislation that's going to be very important to people who are the single-issue people who fly airplanes. And I know a lot of us don't even care. I've heard people say they're all fat cats. You know, I defy anyone to go up to Oshkosh once a year, the last weekend of every July, and see the hundreds of thousands of people up there are not wealthy people. They're single-issue people. Many of them have made airplanes, experimental airplanes in their garages, and this is something that we have enjoyed for many, many years, and it's something that I have enjoyed. But I think because of my involvement, I probably received more complaints and more requests from people out there in the real world, pilots, over things that have happened when the Federal Aviation Administration has caused to try to either revoke their license or give them the fear of revocation. And over the years, there have been several instances where I have passed legislation to fix the system by which the FAA proceeds in these enforcement actions. I can remember back in year 2000, probably yet today, the greatest single pilot, most gifted pilot in America is a guy named Bob Hoover. Bob Hoover is up in years now. He's actually older than I am. And like me, he's still flying airplanes. And Bob Hoover, they did what they call an emergency revocation on Bob Hoover. I never did find out really what allegedly he did wrong, but it actually happened in the field, where this great pilot, in fact, I say, Madam President, he would take a Shrike, a twin-engine Shrike, up to 10,000 feet, cut both engines, do all these aerobatics, come down and roll right up where the crowd is. The guy does things, all of that with a glass of water up there on his dash. And it just is one of these really unbelievable human beings. Anyway, he came to me and said, what am I going to do? They've taken away my livelihood and all of this. And, of course, other people, airline pilots who make a living flying airplanes, they could have an emergency revocation. So, anyway, I passed a law. It took 2 years to do it. It shouldn't have, but it did, that offers some reform in the emergency revocation. So that something happens with a pilot, he gets his license revoked, there is a process he can go through that offers appeals and makes it a fair process. So I've been dealing with this for a long period of time. Now, I have to say this, with any bureaucracy that has the power to take action against an individual, it's our job in Congress to ensure that there are appropriate safeguards in place to prevent agency overreach. This bill provides that. The bill does simply 4 things. I'll run over it real quick. And for those out there who are pilots, they'll understand exactly what I'm talking about. First, it requires the FAA enforcement action against a pilot. In the case there is enforcement action, the FAA's got to grant to the pilot all the relevant evidence, such as the air traffic communications tapes, flight data, investigative reports, flight service station communications, and other relevant air traffic data 30 days before any action can actually be preceded in an enforcement action against a pilot. Now, that is just a matter of fairness. If a person is going to be accused of something, he has to know what he is being accused of. And this is currently not done and often leads to a pilot grossly uninformed of his alleged violation and recourse. Now, the same section requires that the FAA advise a pilot who is the subject of an investigation relating to approval, denial, suspension, modification, revocation of an airman certificate of the nature of the investigation, that an oral or written response to a letter of investigation is not required, that no action can be taken by the FAA against a pilot for declining to respond, that any response can be used as evidence against the pilot, and that the FAA's investigative report is available to the pilot. Now, that sounds like a lot of talk on there. All we're saying is that this pilot is entitled to have all the information that other people have. I'll give you a good example. One of the things that we know, and I've heard all of my 55 years of flying, is that when you talk to a controller, he can be a controller, a control tower, or anything else, that they have to keep that recording. And you can have access to the recording. And I've always thought this is true until something happened to me and I found out that isn't true. So this means that until we have the pilot himself can have access to all of that, it's not going to happen. Secondly, it clarifies the statutory deference. It's a legal term. It relates to the National Transportation Safety Board on actions by the FAA. This is what happens. The FAA would do something, would come, and this could theoretically be appealed to the NTSB. The problem with that is the NTSB, that's the National Transportation Safety Board, has routinely just rubber-stamped anything that comes from the FAA. It's called statutory deference. And so that decision has been able to take place in the appeal process. Now, to give you an example, in fiscal year 10, there are 362 aviation certificate appeals filed with the NTSB's law judges. The board's judges held 61 hearings on these appeals and reversed the FAA order only 5 times. Also, during this time period, there were 40 petitions seeking review of the FAA emergency determinations. Of these, 6 were procedurally defective and were dismissed, and on that basis, and 10 were voluntary. The remaining 24 petitions were considered on their merits, with only one being granted out of 23 being denied. So you know that this is a serious problem. Now, what this does is not only clean up the deference, but it does a second thing. It allows an airman at his own discretion to be able to appeal to the federal district court. The third thing the bill does is require that the FAA undertake a notice to airmen. This is kind of complicated, but a notice to airmen is called a NOTAM, N-O-T-E-A-M. A NOTAM is something that they're supposed to involve the people in, the pilots flying, so that if they're going to go into a certain airport, they'll have all the information as to what's wrong with that airport. Something might be down, a system might be down, any number of things can take place. But nonetheless, it simplifies that system. What we're doing, any pilot knows what a NOTAM is, but for those who don't, their notice is provided by the FAA to give pilots information on airspace, runways, flight conditions, and all that. Now, the procedure is been the thing that hasn't worked, because they've actually said there are NOTAMs, and they didn't even file the NOTAMs, and there's no way for the pilot to be able to tell if there is a NOTAM out there, and even though he's required to determine that there is. The current system merely says that it's the pilot's responsibility to have NOTAMs of an airport, even if the FAA has not posted them. And fourth and finally, the FAA's medical certification process has long been known for a multitude of problems. The Aircraft Owners and Pilots Association receives each year 28% of all of the legal assistance. 28% are related to the FAA's medical certification process and forms to provide greater clarity in questions and reduce the incidents of misinterpretation that have in the past led to allegations of intentional falsification against pilots. The nonprofit general aviation groups, aviation medical examiners, and other qualified medical experts will make up the advisory board. So this is just an advisory board, the same way with revamping the NOTAM process. These are advisory boards that are going to work with the FAA in coming up with a system. So there are 2 provisions that the bill will require FAA review of current practices, and 2 other provisions that make the system specifically fairer for pilots. After years of intervening to help fellow pilots, I was never fully appreciative of the feeling of desperation until it happened to me, and this was last October. I was flying a group of non-pilots, and my twin engine, one of my planes is a twin engine, holds 6 people. We're flying into Cameron County Airport. A lot of people don't realize how big Texas is. Cameron County is way down on the tip of Texas. It's about the same distance south as the as Key Biscayne, Florida, or someplace down there. But it's way down there. I used to be a builder and developer there. I've landed there over 200 times. I was flying a group down there. The Corpus approach handed me off to Valley approach, who took me all the way down to runway 13, and I could go ahead and I'll actually read what they said. The approach control said, "You are cleared for visual approach to runway 13." And and then I responded, and he said, "Yes, 115 Echo Alpha, Roger. Before you go there, there's traffic landing there at 900 feet. That's fine. This is what they do." That's wonderful. And so I started landing. As I started landing, and you get to a point in a twin-engine plane full of people where you're slow enough down that you can't make a go-around. I was almost touching down when I saw that they were working on the runway. It was too late to go around. And the three problems I had, and I've heard countless times from pilots that are corrected, will be corrected with this legislation. When I tried to get the voice recording, it took me 4 months, and I'm a United States Senator. And I think, what about these people out there, the frustration they're going through? So we'll correct that. I was required to respond to allegations within 10 days. By the time I received it, it was 4 more days of accusations on enforcement actions. I didn't even know the reason for the enforcement actions. And then number 3, the NOTAMs, we found out never were posted until 11 days after this took place. In other words, I did nothing wrong, but at any time I could have suffered a revocation of a license. I think it's important to mention that most of the people who work for the FAA, be it controllers, inspectors, investigators, are really helpful. This year is my 32nd consecutive year to attend the Oshkosh fly-in. First thing I always do is I go up there and talk to all the controllers. They're up there as volunteers, and I thank them for what they're doing. Just less than 2 weeks ago, I was flying from Oklahoma to Wyoming. I called up, instrument day, had to get an IFR clearance, 5 a.m. in the morning. The guy's name, he's so courteous, I asked him his name. It's Bill Liebeno, L-I-E-B-E-N-O. And it was, he couldn't have been more helpful to me, though he actually gave me, you talk about giving me all the NOTAMs. He says localizer's out, DME's out, runway 1432 is closed, taxiway B is closed, approach lights are out. He couldn't have been more extremely effectual. Now, I have a lot more to talk about, but I know there are others who want to get in here before this very significant vote that's coming up at 5 o'clock, which I think is a live quorum call. And I would say this. I'm going to introduce this bill on Wednesday. And if there's anyone here, we already have Senators Begich and Johans, who are the co-chairs of the Senate Aviation Caucus. And, of course, this is bipartisan. They're honest co-sponsors, and we have several others as co-sponsors. I would say any staff, I know no members are listening, but any staff who happens to be listening right now, if your member wants to at least be sensitive to the needs of general aviation, this may be his only chance this year. And I suggest that those individuals who really care about the problems I just outlined, that they become co-sponsors of this legislation before I introduce it tomorrow afternoon. With that, I yield the floor, Madam Chair.
Madam President,
The senator from Kentucky.
ask unanimous consent to speak for 10 minutes as if in morning business.
Without objection.
Madam President, I, as well as many Americans, are concerned for the future of our country. I'm concerned that we may not be able to continue to pay our bills. I'm concerned that one day in the near future we could look like Greece. I don't want to see America rioting in the streets because we can't pay our bills. That day is coming. It's coming in the near future if we do not wake up to the problem. I'm not alone in this. Members of the President's own administration have said that the #1 threat to our national security is our national debt. It's out of control. August 2nd is fast approaching. August 2nd is when the debt ceiling is reached. What is the debt ceiling? It's like reaching your credit card limits. If you've got a $5,000 a month credit card limit and you've reached it, do you call up the company and say, give me more credit? Or do you try to live within your means? Do you try to only spend what money you have? We as a country have been spending money we don't have now for really a generation. But it's now gotten out of control. We owe China $1.1 trillion. We owe Japan nearly $1 trillion. It's spending. Spending addiction is our problem. We are now spending, it is just out of control. We are spending $10 billion a day. Of that $10 billion a day, we're borrowing $4 billion. We are spending $100,000 every second. Of that $100,000, we're borrowing $45,000 a second. And we're paying for our debt at historically low interest rates, about 2.5%. But many of us have lived through a time when interest rates were much higher. The historic average is over 5%. If interest rates go back to the historic average, we will be swamped in debt. Interest will become, over the next 10 years, $5 trillion. This is what looms. Our future that looms is not a good one unless we get things under control. So last week, a group of us said no more. We do not want to discuss anything else until we start discussing solutions for the debt, solutions for the looming debt crisis. We said no more. And so today we will win and draw attention back to the debt ceiling. We're not going to talk about anything until we resolve this. But we have to have a real discussion. It's got to include Republicans and Democrats and independents and everyone. But you know what's going on? There's a resolution before the Senate now. The Democrats say raise taxes and that will fix the problem. The problem is not revenue. The problem is spending. We used to spend about $1 in $5 up here. Now we're spending $1 in $4. So $1 in $4 from the economy is coming to Washington. 25% of the GDP is spent in Washington. But that's money that's not left in the marketplace, not left in the hands of those who earned it, and not left in the hands of people who can create jobs. It's being wasted up here. We're not spending the money wisely. We spend more than we take in, and so interest to finance this profligate spending is bankrupting us. The vast majority of our problem is interest, and it will grow. It's growing exponentially. You can look at the chart on interest, and you'll see that interest is going to consume us. If you look as the debt rises, it's rising exponentially over the next few years unless we do something about it. Unfortunately, I don't think the Democrats are serious about this. They've produced a resolution that says they can raise taxes, which is a non-starter. It's a horrible prescription for an economy in the middle of a recession, and it isn't going anywhere. Now, we have proposed a resolution that could fix the problem. Our resolution says that government can simply not act any differently than individuals, that they should have to balance their budget. We've introduced a resolution that says we as Republicans will vote to raise the debt ceiling if we do three things: significant cuts in federal spending, at least back to the percentage we were before we got into this administration, statutory caps. These say we are limited to how much money we can spend each year. And then the third thing is we want a balanced budget amendment. If we have these, we will vote to raise the debt ceiling. But short of that, we can't possibly vote to raise the debt ceiling unless government changes its ways. Government is not spending your money wisely. People can't account for it. Even the Pentagon cannot balance their books. They refuse to be audited because they say they're too big to be audited. We have to do something about a government that's out of control. But we want a serious dialogue with the other side, and instead what we're getting is a frivolousness. So what I would say to the Democrats today is, you want to vote on raising taxes? You think that's an answer? They've got a resolution. I don't want to filibuster their resolution. I'll vote on it tonight. If you want to vote on raising taxes, if the Democrat Party wants to be the party of raising taxes, I'm happy to be in the party that says that's not the answer. So, Madam President, I call for a vote immediately, today. Democrats want to raise taxes, let's do it. I'm happy to vote on that today because it's not the answer. If the other side wants to have a full-throated debate on this, let's do it. Let's debate over the next 2 days, and then we have a solution. Let us vote on raising the debt ceiling. We'll do it the next 2 days. We don't have to wait. Raise the debt ceiling contingent upon a balanced budget amendment. The American people demand it, and I think we should ask for nothing less. Thank you, Madam President, and I yield back.
Madam President.
Senator from Arizona.
Madam President, I asked unanimous consent to engage in a colloquy with my colleague from South Carolina after I make a few remarks.
Without objection.
Madam President, it's pretty obvious that the Senate feels that its priorities, and I think they are well placed, particularly in light of the fact that the 4th of July recess was canceled because of the issue of the debt limit and the deficit and our lack of action and need for action on the issue. And I understand that and have suggested and agreed that this resolution on Libya be delayed. However, I would point out that the Senate does need to have a debate about United States policy and military action in Libya. Whether my colleagues are supportive of what we are doing in Libya or not, I think is an issue that needs to be debated on the floor of the Senate. I believe the Senate does play a constitutional role, and maybe even more unique one than the other body. So I think it's time that we did have a debate, discussion of this issue, and an opinion rendered in keeping with the War Powers Act. Unfortunately, the administration has made it far more difficult than it otherwise might have been if we had carried out our responsibilities and the President carried out his responsibilities some months ago. The fact is that this conflict would have been over if we had taken a leadership role and declared a no-fly zone when the rebel forces were on their way to Benghazi. The fact is that if the United States had used the full weight of its air assets in this conflict, Gaddafi would be gone now. And I would tell my colleagues, have no doubt, Gaddafi will go. He will go. The question is when. And what role did the United States of America play in supporting these people who are fighting for freedom? What role did the United States of America play in trying to free up Gaddafi's ill-gotten gains and have them given to the Transition National Council? What role did the United States play in leading from behind in Libya? The United States of America leads, not NATO. We lead NATO. And when someone says NATO is leading on this conflict, I would remind my colleagues of the 28 members of NATO, only 8 members are actually in the fight. And one of our major allies, Germany, has taken a hike. So if we had used the AC-130 gunships, the A-10 Warthog close air support capability, Gaddafi would be gone now. But the fact is he will go. And it is up to us, in my view, to express our support of people who are seeking the same rights and freedoms that are guaranteed to us. So, and I would remind my colleagues who said we never should have been involved in any way, it is a fact that Gaddafi and his forces were at the gates of Benghazi, a city of 700,000 people, and Gaddafi said that he would go house to house and kill whoever they thought had resisted them. Now, we say that we should never have allowed Srebrenica, where 8,000 people were massacred. We say we should never have allowed Rwanda to happen. We say we should never have allowed the Holocaust to happen. The United States did the right thing by stopping Gaddafi's forces at the gates of Benghazi and preventing the massacre of I don't know how many thousands of innocent civilians. And there is no doubt what Gaddafi has promised if he's able to remain in power, a man who has the blood of Americans on his hands because of the bombing of Pan Am 103, because of terrorist acts that he supported in Africa, and he will do so again and has pledged to do so. When my colleagues ask what American national security interests are at stake, look at the man's past actions and look what he has promised to do if he is able to stay in power, and that is to pose a direct threat to the United States of America's vital national security interests. We are involved in Libya. We're providing, as my colleague from South Carolina will testify, we're providing refueling, we're providing intelligence, we are providing all kinds of assistance, and we are including using predators which are killing the bad guys. And so to somehow allege that the United States is not engaged in hostility, which would trigger the War Powers Act, is simply sophistry. And the Senate has been silent on this issue for too long, in my view. But I also want to caution my colleagues about preventing United States action as well as authorizing. The last time the United States of America, the Congress of the United States of America, engaged in cutting off funding was at the end of the Vietnam War. And whether historians or people happen to acknowledge it, a lot of bad things happened after we cut off funding in Vietnam, and amongst them was millions of Vietnamese putting in re-education camps and thousands slaughtered. So I would caution my colleagues about actions of Congress which prohibit certain actions on the part of the administration. But most of all, America should lead. We should use our air assets, not our ground assets, to get rid of this brutal dictator and his regime. Every day that goes by, innocent civilians in Libya are wounded and killed. So I'd ask my colleague from South Carolina if he had a few words, but also to address the issue of how much U.S. involvement actually is there, which would then, by most objective observers, trigger the United States Congress's requirement to act in keeping with the War Powers Act and our constitutional obligations.
Well, I thank the Senator, and I'll give you my thoughts as briefly as I can. My first thought is that we live in incredibly dangerous times, exciting and dangerous. What is the Arab Spring about? What are people asking for in Libya? They're asking to replace Gaddafi and form a new government where they'll have a say. I don't think that's too much to ask. All I can say is that America's freedom is best secured when she, America, is assisting others to obtain theirs. And the one thing history tells us, free people settle their differences without resorting to the evils of war. So to those in this body and throughout the country, I know we're broke. We're here today to supposedly talk about the budget. Well, we're not doing anything but talking. We're $14.3 trillion in debt. There's all kind of ideas between Republicans and Democrats how to get the country's fiscal house in order. It's the 5th of July, and we're up here looking at each other, doing nothing. But there's another part of the world, as the Senate and the House basically talks about America being in debt. There are people dying as I speak trying to change their government for the better. And what should we do? I tell you what we should do. We should help where we can. And Senator McCain has experienced war unlike very few people in this body. And he knows that when you go to war, bad things happen to good people. And to the idea that he or myself or anybody else relishes trying to go to war or being in war is offensive, quite frankly, because he knows better than I, and I have a pretty good understanding of what happens when you go to war. But here's what happens when you don't, sometimes. Bad people are able to do incredible things that you wind up having to confront later, and it costs everybody more to have waited. So what are we doing in Libya? We're following rather than leading. Now, to Senator McCain's question, NATO bombing activities are being done without American air power. We spend more money than all NATO nations combined on defense. I know a lot of Americans don't like that. I don't like it either, but it's the way it is. We are the arsenal of democracy. When America doesn't fly, wars go on longer. More people get raped, more people get killed. And let me tell you, if Gaddafi survives, that this is the end of NATO. And if you don't want America to go along in this dangerous world, count me in. But who are we going to partner with? If the UN is seen by the American people as an unreliable group to deal with dictators, and it is, what if NATO is no longer an organization that people throughout the world respect on the side of good, And the evil side of the ledger doesn't care if NATO gets involved because they don't have the will to do anything about it. So we should be involved with our NATO partners. Our NATO partners depend on Libya more than we do. They came to Afghanistan not because they were attacked, but because we were attacked. They were our friends. They're our allies. They've been with us trying to make sure Afghanistan never goes back into the darkness, a place to attack us or them again. So when they need us, I would tell President Obama, now's not the time to sit on the sidelines. I know we're a war-weary nation, but there is no upside to Gaddafi staying in power. That is a national security nightmare for this country. Here's a recent headline. Gaddafi threatens to attack European over airstrikes. Colonel Gaddafi has threatened to carry out attacks against homes, offices, families in Europe unless NATO stops his campaign of airstrikes against his regime in Libya. He actually means it. Hitler meant it. He means it. So we should be talking about the debt. We're not. We should be taking a stand against Gaddafi in an effective way. And as you said, Senator McCain, we're leading from behind. And I just cannot tell you how upset I am with policies coming from this administration that are sending a signal to our allies that we're not as reliable as we should be, and to our enemies that we don't have the same amount of will to protect our freedom as they do to take it away from us.
I'd ask my friend, isn't it true that we are providing tanker support, logistic support, predator strikes, intelligence, and all kinds of assets to those 8 nations that are involved in the fight? And when you are using predators and killing people, that's pretty well fits the definition of hostilities. And yet, for reasons which are still not clear to me, the administration fails to acknowledge that. Well, perhaps could I also just say one thing that is very concerning as well is this recognition of the Transition National Council. I know my colleague, because we were just in Turkey, noticed that another country, Turkey, one of the most important nations in the Middle East, just recognized the Transition National Council, froze the assets that Gaddafi has, and yet this administration refuses to do so. There are some $30 billion, I am told, of Gaddafi assets that we could freeze and make available to the Transition National Council. It may require some legislative action, but it requires administration leadership, and they could then pay people, could provide arms and weapons to their own people, as well as subsidies for the government. Again, an example of leading from behind. The French, the Italians, the Turks, and other nations have all now recognized the Transition National Council, yet the United States has failed to do so.
If I could try to answer the hostility question. When you're using Predator drones to bring down military targets, that to me is an acceptable situation in Libya. I don't want ground troops in Libya. The people in Libya don't want a ground invasion by NATO forces. They want our help. And what do we have to offer better than anybody in the world? Intelligence gathering. These platforms that are gathering information about targets, Senator McCain, are unique to America. The target packages that are being put together are being done mostly by Americans, and we're turning these target packages over to NATO countries. Some of the aircraft they're flying, and God bless our allies for taking this risk, are 30 years old. No one has the ability like the American Air Force and Naval Forces to carry on aerial campaigns. But some people in this body have a right to have their say like we do. We should be debating this. But the administration's position that a Predator drone attack is not a hostile act is dangerous. Because Yemen, the administration, with my full support, is taking the fight to Yemen today. They're using Predator drone attacks against al-Qaeda groups in Yemen. We just had special forces involved in killing al-Qaeda operatives in Somalia. We have to be on the offensive. We need to be hitting these people over there before they can reorganize and hit us here. So I support the administration's ability and constitutional right to take the fight to the enemy. But for them, Senator McCain, to tell the body these are not hostile acts is the ultimate confusion. It's confusing to the enemy. It's confusing to our allies. It's confusing to the American people. And I reject this definition being offered by this administration that using Predator drones to attack targets is not a hostile act. I believe that the War Powers Act is unconstitutional. There's two things we can do in this body as a member of Congress. We can declare war and we can cut off funding when we don't like things the way they're going. We very seldom declare war in this nation from a congressional point of view for a reason, but we have constantly engaged forces that wish to attack us and our allies without declarations of war. If you don't like what we're doing in Libya, cut off funding. Don't try to micromanage the war through congressional fiat. So $30 billion is available to the Libyan people. It's money frozen, stolen by Gaddafi. The Turkish government, the French, the British in some sense, have recognized this Transition National Council. If we would do that, they would have access to the $30 billion. And Senator McCain, you've met with the leadership of this council. I have too. They would gladly pay us back for any assistance we could provide if they could get their hands on the money. Do you agree with that?
I've been assured personally by the leadership of the Transitional Council, by the way, one who has a doctorate from the University of Pittsburgh. Their finance minister was an economics professor at the University of Washington. So let's dispel any illusions about we don't know who they are. They're good and decent people who have risen up against an oppressive and repressive dictator and murderer, that they want to reimburse the United States for our expenses the way the Kuwaitis and the Saudis did after Operation Desert Storm. But the point is that, again, I'd say to my colleague, anybody who believes that it is not in America's national security interest to see Gaddafi gone has paid no attention to his words and his actions. And history will record how the United States stood on people who are struggling both peacefully and where it necessitated the use of the force of arms is where the United States of America was.
And if I may, we've got our good colleague, Naval Intelligence Officer, Senator Kurt from Illinois, and we'll certainly yield to him now. But one last thought. America needs to do two things quickly. We need to get our fiscal house in order. We need to balance our budget and decide among ourselves how important is national security. To me, it's the number one thing we should do in Congress. If we don't get that right, there is nothing else that's going to matter. There'll never be economic prosperity in America if the world is in the hands of evil people who will make it very difficult for us to travel and trade and do business. And the other thing we need to do after we balance our budget is to have a clear vision of who we are and what we believe. I believe that we're destined to lead the free world. I don't consider it a burden. I consider it the birthright of all Americans, not only to maintain our freedom, but to help others secure theirs. And a word of warning, the day that America rejects that leadership role is a day we will eventually lose our freedom, and more damage will be done to this country if we disengage than if we do engage. So with that, I would like to recognize Senator Kurt from Illinois.
I would like to agree with the gentleman on Libya. But I understand from the majority leader that we are not going to take up the Libya resolution now. And I would just urge them that before we descend into any potential partisan warfare on any other issue, there is a bill that is ready for the Senate consideration right now. That is overwhelmingly, unanimously approved by Democrats and Republicans on the Appropriations Committee. And it's ready for Senate consideration this week. My hope is that we will now, or maybe tomorrow, take up the Military Construction and VA Appropriations Bill, which Senator Johnson and I have co-authored, which Senator Inouye and Senator Cochran have approved. It's $1.2 billion in discretionary spending below the President's request. It's $620 million below the enacted level, and it's even $2.6 million in budget authority below the House mark. This is ready to go. And so, absent debate on some other resolution which has little to no future in the House of Representatives, my hope is that we will follow the House that has already approved the VA MILCON appropriations bill. We will take up overwhelmingly bipartisan legislation that benefits our men and women in uniform and those veterans, and that we will not waste this week on legislation that has little to no future. Instead, we will achieve something this week by having taken up the MILCON VA bill, which was so overwhelmingly approved by the Senate Appropriations Committee just last week. And with that, Madam President, I yield the floor.
The Majority Leader.
I appreciate my friend's advice on how to run the Senate. I appreciate it very much. We're working to make sure that this week is spent on debating something relating to the #1 issue facing the country today, and that's how to make sure that we get a handle on the deficit spending that takes place. I would note the absence of quorum.
The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Akaka. Mr. Alexander. Ms. Ayotte. Mr. Barrasso. Mr. Balkus. Mr. Bekich. Mr. Bennett. Mr. Bingaman. Mr. Blumenthal. Mr. Blunt. Mr. Bozeman. Mrs. Boxer. Mr. Brown of Massachusetts. Mr. Brown of Ohio. Mr. Burr. Ms. Cantwell. Mr. Cardin. Mr. Carper. Mr. Casey. Mr. Chambliss. Mr. Coates. Mr. Coburn. Mr. Cochran. Ms. Collins. Mr. Conrad. Mr. Coons. Mr. Corker. Mr. Cornyn. Mr. Crapo. Mr. Dement. Mr. Durbin. Mr. Enzi. Mrs. Feinstein. Mr. Franken. Mrs. Gillibrand. Mr. Graham. Mr. Grassley. Mrs. Hagan. Mr. Harkin. Mr. Hatch. Mr. Heller. Mr. Hoven. Mrs. Hutchison. Mr. Inhofe. Mr. Noway. Mr. Isaacson. Mr. Johans. Mr. Johnson of Wisconsin. Mr. Johnson of South Dakota. Mr. Carey. Mr. Kirk. Ms. Klobuchar. Mr. Cole. Mr. Kyle. Ms. Landrieu. Mr. Lautenberg. Mr. Leahy. Mr. Lee. Mr. Levin. Mr. Lieberman. Mr. Lugar. Mr. Manchin. Mr. McCain. Mrs. McCaskill. Mr. McConnell. Mr. Menendez. Mr. Merkley. Ms. Mikulski. Mr. Moran. Ms. Murkowski. Mrs. Murray. Mr. Nelson of Nebraska. Mr. Nelson of Florida. Mr. Paul. Mr. Portman. Mr. Pryor. Mr. Reed of Rhode Island. Mr. Reed of Nevada. Mr. Risch. Mr. Roberts. Mr. Rockefeller. Mr. Rubio. Mr. Sanders. Mr. Schumer. Mr. Sessions. Mrs. Shaheen. Mr. Shelby. Ms. Snow. Ms. Stabenow. Mr. Tester. Mr. Thune. Mr. Toomey. Mr. Udall of Colorado. Mr. Udall of New Mexico. Mr. Vitter. Mr. Warner. Mr. Webb. Mr. Whitehouse. Mr. Wicker. Mr. Wyden. A quorum is not present.
A quorum is not present.
Mr. President,
Majority Leader.
I've moved and instructed Sergeant Arms to request the presence of absent senators. And I'd ask the yeas and nays.
Is there a sufficient second? There appears to be. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Akaka, Mr. Alexander, Ms. Ayotte, Mr. Barrasso, Mr. Baucus, Mr. Begich, Mr. Bennett, Mr. Bingaman, Mr. Blumenthal, Mr. Blunt, Mr. Bozeman, Mrs. Boxer, Mr. Brown of Massachusetts, Mr. Brown of Ohio, Mr. Burr, Ms. Cantwell, Mr. Cardin, Mr. Carper, Mr. Casey. Mr. Chambliss. Mr. Coates. Mr. Coburn. Mr. Cochran. Ms. Collins. Mr. Conrad. Mr. Coons. Mr. Corker. Mr. Cornyn.
Here, present. What do I say? Aye.
Mr. Crapo.
There's your first answers. They're numbered.
Mr. Dummett. Mr. Durbin. Mr. Enzi. Mrs. Feinstein.
Yeah, he voted.
Mr. Franken. Mrs. Gillibrand. Mr. Graham. Mr. Grassley. Mrs. Hagan. Mr. Harkin. Mr. Hatch. Mr. Heller. Mr. Hoven. Mrs. Hutchison. Mr. Inhofe. Mr. Inouye. Mr. Isaacson. Mr. Johans. Mr. Johnson of Wisconsin. Mr. Johnson of South Dakota. Mr. Kerry. Mr. Kirk. Ms. Klobuchar. Mr. Cole. Mr. Kyle. Ms. Landrieu. Mr. Lautenberg. Mr. Leahy. Mr. Lee. Mr. Levin. Mr. Lieberman. Mr. Lugar. Mr. Manchin. Mr. McCain. Mrs. McCaskill. Mr. McConnell. Mr. Menendez. Mr. Merkley. Ms. Mikulski. Mr. Moran. Ms. Murkowski. Mrs. Murray. Mr. Nelson of Nebraska. Mr. Nelson of Florida. Mr. Paul. Mr. Paul. Mr. Portman. Mr. Pryor. Mr. Reed, Rhode Island. Mr. Reed of Nevada. Mr. Risch. Mr. Roberts. Mr. Rockefeller. Mr. Rubio. Mr. Sanders. Mr. Schumer. Mr. Sessions. Mrs. Shaheen. Mr. Shelby. Ms. Snow. Ms. Stabenow. Mr. Tester. Mr. Thune. Mr. Toomey. Mr. Udall of Colorado. Mr. Udall of New Mexico. Mr. Vitter. Mr. Warner. Mr. Webb. Mr. Whitehouse. Mr. Wicker. Mr. Wyden. Senators voting in the affirmative: Ayotte, Begich, Bingaman, Brown of Massachusetts, Cantwell, Cardin, Casey, Coates, Cochran, Conrad, Corker, Crapo, Franken, Grassley, Hagan, Harkin, Hatch, Hutchison, Inouye, Isaacson, Johans, Johnson of Wisconsin, Johnson of South Dakota, Kirk, Klobuchar, Leahy, Levin, McCain, Moran, Nelson of Nebraska, Pryor, Reed of Rhode Island, Reed of Nevada, Risch, Rockefeller, Sanders, Shaheen, Stabenow, Tester, Udall of New Mexico, Webb, Wicker, Wyden. Mr. Blumenthal, aye. Senators voting in the negative: Coburn, Collins, Cornyn, Graham, Inhofe, Paul, Vitter. Mr. Sessions, aye. Mr. Lugar, aye. Mr. Bozeman, aye. Mr. Blunt, aye. Mr. Akaka, aye. Mr. Shelby, aye. Mr. Carey, aye. Mr. Durbin, aye. Mr. Coons. Mr. Coons, aye. Mrs. Boxer. Mrs. Boxer, aye. Mr. Enzi. Mr. Enzi, no. Mr. Menendez. Mr. Menendez, aye. Mr. Barrasso. Mr. Barrasso, no. Ms. Snow. Ms. Snow, aye. Mr. Roberts. Mr. Roberts, aye. Mrs. Feinstein. Mrs. Feinstein, aye. Mr. McConnell. Mr. McConnell, no. Mr. Warner. Mr. Warner, aye. Mr. Portman. Mr. Portman, aye. Mr. Cole. Mr. Cole, aye. Mr. Paul. Mr. Paul, aye. Mr. Rubio. Mr. Rubio, aye. Mr. Thune. Mr. Thune, aye. Mr. Manchin. Mr. Manchin, aye. Mr. Hoven. Mr. Hoven, no. Mr. Hoven. Mr. Hoven, aye. Ms. Mikulski. Ms. Mikulski, aye. Mr. Lautenberg. Mr. Lautenberg, aye. Ms. Landrieu. Ms. Landrieu, aye. Mr. Toomey. Mr. Toomey, aye. Mr. Udall of Colorado. Mr. Udall of Colorado, aye. Mr. Merkley. Mr. Merkley, aye. Mr. Whitehouse. Mr. Whitehouse, aye. Mrs. McCaskill. Mrs. McCaskill, aye. Mr. Brown of Ohio. Mr. Brown of Ohio, aye. Mr. Nelson of Florida. Mr. Nelson of Florida, aye. Ms. Collins. Ms. Collins, aye. Mrs. Gillibrand. Mrs. Gillibrand. Aye. Mr. Chambliss. Mr. Chambliss. Aye. Mr. Baucus. Mr. Baucus. Aye. Mr. Schumer. Mr. Schumer, aye. Mr. Carper. Mr. Carper, aye. Mr. Bennett. Mr. Bennett, aye.